Chicago is a famous city, and it is home to many famous places and famous things. For instance, there is that one building that is officially called one thing, but everyone calls by a different name. There is that other tourist attraction that is officially called one thing, but everyone calls by a different name. And there are even a few regions and neighborhoods that would be familiar to many who don't live in the city. One such area, familiar to many tourists and the like, is Chicago's downtown. It's also well known that it's not typically referred to as downtown in Chicago. Instead, we call it the Loop. The reason for this, as you may already know, is deeply connected to the history of another Chicago icon, the L. And this sounds like a fantastic opportunity for another installment of The Oldest Rails. As you may have noticed in that introductory graphic, this video technically pertains to one of my favorite CTA lines, the Purple Line. So, how fitting is it that the oldest section of this line would in fact be the tracks that make up the loop itself? So, for one of my favorite lines, I get to tell you the story of Chicago's iconic elevated loop. In previous episodes in this series, we looked at the history of some CTA lines that were built by the Northwestern Elevated Railroad beginning in 1900. But our story today starts even before that. The story of the loop begins in the early 1890s with the Lake Street Elevated Railroad. On November 6, 1893, the Lake Street opened their main line, which ran above Lake Street from California Avenue to Market Street, which we would today know as Wacker Drive. Swinging southward along Market Street, the line terminated as Stub at Market and Madison. This was a rather inconvenient terminal, both for railroad operations as well as for passengers who needed to get pretty much anywhere else in downtown. The Lake Street Elevated hoped to find a way to reach their line further into the city, but the Cities and Villages Act of 1872 required them to obtain approval from adjacent property owners for any further extension into the city, and, as one might imagine, that was nearly impossible to accomplish. Indeed, the Lake Street was not the only elevated railroad to struggle with this issue. The Southside Rapid Transit Company had to terminate their line at Holden Court and Congress Parkway, which is now Ida B. Wells Drive. And when the Metropolitan West Side Elevated opened their line in 1895, they constructed a temporary terminal at Franklin and Jackson. This left a sort of quarter of a circle of elevated rail terminals around the center of the city, with no adequate access into the city itself. Serious political negotiation abilities would be needed to convince property owners in downtown to allow the construction of any additional railroad infrastructure to serve it. This negotiation ability would come in the form of a man named Charles Tyson Yerkes. All of my fellow Jago Hazard fans rejoice. Yerkes was an extremely wealthy and extremely influential man who invested in numerous railway schemes throughout his life, albeit his methods were extremely shady and dishonest, and he was constantly running from city to city to escape the consequences of his previous actions. But the effect he has had, especially the work he did both in Chicago and in London, is undeniable. Yerkes, already involved in a plan to open what would become the Northwestern Elevated Railroad, took control of the Lake Street Elevated as well. His goal was to create a singular downtown terminal that could tie together both of his railroads, and to get the other two elevateds on board as well. This would help strengthen his case. To achieve this end politically, Yerkes created a third company, the Union Loop Company. He then embarked on 4 separate quests to achieve approval for the 4 different sides of what would eventually become the loop. Generally, his strategy centered around making a certain section of the loop appear as though it was doing something completely unrelated, and the fact that he had control of so many independent companies helped him greatly here. He would keep up this guise only to the point where he could obtain the necessary number of signatures, and then once that plan was approved, Yerkes would quickly shift around the plan and change what he actually delivered, until he would eventually end with the result that he wanted. In at least one case, Yerkes promised a line that would go nearly twice as far as he actually intended to build it, extending into areas where he knew that more property owners would approve of such a line. This increased the number of positive signatures he received, thus getting his plan approved. And then he would, of course, only build the originally planned line. As I said, he was extremely shady in his business practices. Because Yerkes used this piecemeal process to get all 4 sections of the loop approved separately, construction would also occur in various stages. In some cases, planning for one side of the loop would be completed before it was even finalized above which street another section would be constructed. The first section of the loop to open was the part over Lake Street. This was the easiest since the Lake Street Elevated already owned a line over Lake Street. On September 22, 1895, they constructed a branch off of their line from the point where it curved south onto Market Street. From this point, the new branch continued over Lake Street, essentially becoming the main line, while the Market Street section became the branch. At this point, nearly all Lake Street trains were diverted to run on the new line into downtown, with very few continuing to serve the Market branch. This new extension ran east, with new stations being added at 5th Avenue, Clark Street, and State Street. The structure continued past State to Wabash in anticipation of future extension. This extension was completed on November 8, 1896, with the tracks curving south over Wabash Avenue. Stations were added at Randolph Street, Madison Street, and Adams Street. Then, finally, nearly a year later, on October 3, 1897, the remaining half of the loop was opened. The line was extended from Wabash, running west along Van Buren Street, with stations at State Street, Dearborn Street, and Pacific Avenue. Finally, the structure curved northward again, running over 5th Avenue. Along this side of the loop, stations were added at Quincy Street, Madison Street, and Randolph Street. The 5th Avenue side of the loop met the Lake Street side right where 5th and Lake Station had been built. This was a result of that segmented planning and approval process that they had gone through, which meant that when 5th and Lake Station was planned, it wasn't even known yet which street the western side of the loop was even going to use. In order to complete the construction of the 5th Avenue section, 5th and Lake Station was closed, receiving the dubious honor of being the first permanent L station to be closed. The Lake Street Elevated now had a complete loop around downtown. The original intent was for 3 stations on each of the 4 sides of the loop, and interlocking towers on 3 of the 4 corners to allow for connection to the various other elevated railroads. Of course, one of these towers would end up replacing one of these stations, but such was the original plan. The Lake Street assigned numbers to each junction and each station. These numbers numerically increased in a counterclockwise fashion around the loop. For reasons that are not entirely clear, they started with number 8. Presumably this was because numbers 1 to 7 were either used or intended to be used elsewhere in the network, but exactly what this was has been lost to history. Anyway, they started with Tower 8, which was located at the corner of 5th Avenue and Van Buren Street. From here, working counterclockwise, this would put Station 9 at Pacific and Van Buren, Station 10 at Dearborn and Van Buren, Station 11 at State and Van Buren, Tower 12 at Wabash and Van Buren, Station 13 at Adams and Wabash, Station 14 at Madison and Wabash, Station 15 at Randolph and Wabash, Station 16 at State and Lake, and Station 17 at Clark and Lake. Since this numbering system began before the loop was fully completed, 5th and Lake Station was also known as Station 18. When it closed in 1897, the tower at 5th and Lake became known as Tower 18. Continuing down 5th Avenue, Station 19 was at Randolph and 5th, Station 20 at Madison and 5th, and Station 21 at Quincy and 5th. This would be the loop's layout for the first 15 to 20 years of its operation, the main exception to this being in 1901 when Pacific Avenue was renamed. North of Jackson Boulevard, the street was already known by the name LaSalle, so the full length was renamed to LaSalle at this time, causing the subsequent renaming of Pacific Avenue Station to LaSalle and Van Buren. But I get ahead of myself. Back to 1897. When the full loop opened, Lake Street trains were then able to enter the loop, make a full circle around, and then exit the loop to begin the return trip to the terminal at Laramie Avenue. All this without needing to turn the train around. Trains would only traverse the loop in one direction, but the line was double-tracked all the way around. At the time, there wasn't much of a standard practice for trains running on the right or the left-hand side of a double-tracked line. It was kind of just whatever each railroad decided on. The Lake Street, for their part, ran their trains on the left side. This meant that it was the most logical for trains entering the loop to remain on the left-hand side, continuing down the Lake Street tracks, on what we would today refer to as the outer loop track. This prevented them from having to cross over and make the right-hand turn onto the 5th Avenue section, and then when trains came back out of the loop on 5th Avenue, they could then make the left-hand turn back onto Lake Street, again, without interference. This is essentially the same concept that might be observed when driving a car in a country like the United States, how right-hand turns are much easier to make than left because it doesn't require crossing over any other travel paths. In this case, of course, it's just reversed since these trains were running on the left-hand side. On October 11th of 1897, just 8 days after the loop was opened, the Metropolitan West Side Elevated connected their main line to the loop at Tower 8. They would end up demolishing the terminal at Franklin Street. The Metropolitan used a right-hand running on their line, but since the Lake Street controlled the loop, Metropolitan line trains actually had to cross over onto the left-hand side before entering the loop. This put them on the inner loop track, running east along Van Buren Street. These trains would then circle the loop in a counterclockwise fashion, using the opposite track and opposite platform, traveling the opposite direction of Lake Street trains. This provided convenience for passengers traveling around the loop, since service now operated in both directions. And it also kept passengers from the two companies separated on two separate platforms, so that each line could still charge their own fare. And you can even see evidence of this in some of the loop stations today, where you pay your fare in a different place depending on which platform you're headed up to. Upon returning to Tower 8, Metropolitan trains exited the loop and crossed back over to the right-hand side to continue their trip back to one of the Metropolitan's 4 West Side terminals. Just another week later, on October 18th, the last of the 3 elevator railroads joined the loop. The Southside Rapid Transit Company diverted all of their trains from their old terminal at Congress Street over a new curve to Tower 12. Much like the Metropolitan line trains, they needed to cross over to the left-hand side of the loop before entering. This put the SSRT on the inner loop track along with the Metropolitan. Barriers were put in place halfway along each platform. On the inner loop side, passengers had to pay a Metropolitan line fare to reach the front half of the platform, but had to pay an SSRT fare to reach the rear half. Trains would stop only at their respective half of the platform, ensuring that passengers were paying their fare to the correct company for the train that they boarded. For the time being, the front halves of the outer loop platforms were blocked off, with Lake Street trains using the rear half of each of these platforms. SSRT trains would also circle the loop counterclockwise, and on returning to Tower 12, they would exit the loop, cross back over to the right-hand side, and then return to the SSRT terminal at Jackson Park. The next change to the loop would come on May 31st of 1900, when the Northwestern Elevated Railroad, also backed by Yerkes, would finally begin its operations. The Northwestern is lined up approached the loop from the north along 5th Avenue, also entering at Tower 18, in the same location as the Lake Street elevated. Since the Northwestern shared ownership with the Lake Street, they too had adopted the practice of left-hand running. This put the trains on the outer loop track, meaning that they turned westward immediately upon entering the loop. Beginning at Clark and Lake, these trains would operate clockwise around the loop, using the hitherto unused front halves of each of the outer loop platforms, and would then exit the loop back at Tower 18, making the return trip to Wilson Avenue. For the next decade, the loop would operate in this fashion, with the four companies sharing the tracks themselves, but not much else. They continued to operate independently, with each company entering and exiting the loop on their respective main line. This was not an efficient system. During rush hours, each company was running as intensive a service as possible and running all these trains into the loop. By 1902, the loop was getting too crowded, and it was agreed that something had to be done to manage the congestion. The Lake Street had it the easiest here. They were still using their Market Street stub terminal for some trains, so they simply had to divert more of the rush hour trains to this branch instead. The SSRT was in a similar situation. Although they hadn't used it since the opening of the loop, they still had their Congress Street terminal and were able to divert some rush hour services there instead. The Metropolitan and Northwestern railroads were not so lucky. The former of these two had decommissioned their downtown terminal, and the latter had never constructed one. The Metropolitan line would terminate some of their services at Canal Street, but for the most part, from what it seems, these two railroads would continue to operate most of their services into the loop for the time being. The Metropolitan would be the first to rectify this in 1904 when they opened a new terminal facility on 5th Avenue, about halfway between Van Buren Street and Jackson Boulevard. The Northwestern would follow suit in 1908. As part of a major expansion and improvement work on their line that year, they opened a new terminal at North Water Street, just north of the river. On November 3, 1913, the four elevated railway companies entered into an official partnership as Chicago's Elevated Railways, or the CER. Under the partnership, the railroads could coordinate fares and operations. Gone was the need for the dividing barriers on station platforms, as fares were integrated, and passengers could now transfer between trains without paying a second fare. This went a long way to improve connectivity, making it easier for passengers to travel between destinations that were not in downtown and not on the same line. But the CER companies thought that they could do better. If fares were already integrated, and of course all of their tracks were already connected, there was no need for trains to remain on the same line where they started. If trains could enter the loop from one line and then exit onto a different line, one-seat rides could be offered between destinations on opposite sides of the city. This seemed like an attractive possibility. So, on the same day that the partnership was finalized, Crosstown L service was begun, with trains running from the Northwestern's main line, now extending both to Kimball and Linden, down into the loop, and continuing south on the SSRT's line, which now had terminals in Englewood, Jackson Park, Normal Park, Kenwood, and Stockyards. Also, with operations being shared across multiple lines, it was decided that a standard needed to be set for the whole left versus right-hand running thing. As right-handed operations were becoming more standard in the United States, it was decided to shift all operations over to right-hand running. Between this and the new Crosstown service starting, loop operations would need to be completely revised. Effective on this date, both loop tracks began operating in the same direction, counterclockwise. Metropolitan trains would continue to operate in exactly the same manner as they had previously. Lake Street trains now had their loop reversed, operating counterclockwise as opposed to their original clockwise. Some SSRT trains would continue their normal counterclockwise loop, but most operated the new Crosstown pattern, and the Northwestern was much the same in this way. Southbound trains making crosstown trips would come south on the Northwestern's main line, enter the loop at Tower 18, and run counterclockwise, serving the stations on 5th Avenue and Van Buren Street before reaching Tower 12, where they would leave the loop to run south on the SSRT's line. Inversely, northbound trains would come up the SSRT line, enter the loop at Tower 12, serving stations on Wabash Avenue and Lake Street, before exiting at Tower 18 and running up the Northwestern's line. This operational pattern would persist for some time, and the loop saw only a few major changes over the coming decades. In 1916, 5th Avenue was renamed to Wells Street, and the stations on 5th Avenue were renamed to what we would probably recognize them as today. In 1919, the North Shore and Milwaukee Railroad, also called the North Shore Line, began operating on the Northwestern and SSRT's lines to connect Northside passengers through the loop to Roosevelt Road. And in 1924, the four companies that made up the CER would officially merge into a single company, known as the Chicago Rapid Transit Company, or the CRT. By the 1930s, the loop was getting crowded again. The CRT had taken note of the fact that, over the last 30 years, significant progress had been made at constructing deep-level subways to carry trains underneath the most dense part of cities. Other cities in the United States, such as New York and Boston, had started relocating much of their transit into subway tunnels. Plans were made to construct 2 new subway tunnels under Chicago's central business district. This would take some of the pressure off of the loop. The first subway, which was termed Subway Route 1, would run under State Street, connecting the lines to the north with the lines to the south. The second subway, termed Subway Route 2, would run under Milwaukee Avenue, Dearborn Street, and Congress Parkway, connecting up various lines on the west side. Construction on both of these subways began in 1938. Partway through the project, World War II began, and material shortages put a halt to non-military construction projects across the city, including Subway Route Number 2. Subway Route Number 1, however, was considered to be an essential transportation link and was prioritized to be completed. On October 17, 1943, this subway, now named the State Street Subway, finally opened. This meant that Crosstown trains could now pass from the north side main line to the south side main line, traveling under the loop instead of through it. The CRT immediately began to route some of these Crosstown trains through the subway, but some would continue to operate in the loop as well. On October 1st, 1947, the Chicago Transit Authority, or the CTA, was formed as a governmental body to assume operation of all of the elevated railroads, in order to replace the CRT, which was failing as a result of the decline in railroad profitability that came with the advent of the automobile. One major goal for the CTA upon taking over the system was to improve system efficiency and eliminate redundant services. This process was referred to as the rationalization process. Crosstown service was perhaps one of the most confusing and complicated parts of the system at the time. The main line on the north side was 4 tracks, so trains could run either local or express. There were 2 branches to the north, Evanston and Ravenswood, 2 possible routes the trains could take to get through downtown, either the elevated loop or the State Street subway, and 5 different branches on the south side, Kenwood, Stockyards, Englewood, Normal Park, and Jackson Park. Oh, and the trains off of any one of those branches would sometimes simply enter the loop, circle around, and return to their starting point. Not only did this involve running way more trains over these routes than was needed, it was also very confusing for the average rider. On August 1st, 1949, the CTA struck hard with their new rationalization measures. Crosstown trains would run only between Howard on the north side and the Englewood and Jackson Park terminals on the south side, and they would use the State Street subway. Trains from the Kimball terminal on the Ravenswood branch would run around the loop. Every other branch was reduced simply to a shuttle service that would operate to the nearest interchange station with the main line. The exception to this was the Evanston line, which would operate as a shuttle between Linden and Howard, but during rush hour on Monday to Saturday, trains would run south of Howard as express trains until they reached the loop. These trains would then circle the loop and return to Howard and Linden respectively. Overall, these changes drastically reduced the number of trains that would need to travel through the loop down to just 4 routes: the Ravenswood line, the Lake Street line, trains from various metropolitan branches, and, during rush hours, the Evanston Express. Since the Metropolitan line trains entered and exited at Tower 8, and the remainder of these services entered and exited at Tower 18, this actually meant that no CTA trains were actually using Tower 12. The North Shore line, however, continued to use this connection to Roosevelt Station. Also at this time, the terminals at Congress and Northwater were closed, since the new Crosstown service pattern did not require their use. The station at Dearborn and Van Buren was also closed as a way to simply speed up service in the loop. At the time, the station received relatively little use, and it was extremely close to the adjacent station at LaSalle Street on one side and the station at State Street on the other. 11 months later, on July 7, 1950, Saturday service on the Evanston Express was discontinued, with this service now only running during the rush hour Monday through Friday. The next year, on February 25, 1951, work was finally completed on the second of those subway routes. As I mentioned earlier, this subway was to run under Milwaukee Avenue, Dearborn Street, and Congress Parkway. For the time being, this subway dead-ended at LaSalle and Congress, but trains on the Northwest branch to Logan Square and the Humboldt Park branch to Lawndale were split off from the other former Metropolitan line trains and run into the subway, further reducing the number of trains into the loop. In 1953, work began on rebuilding Congress Parkway to the west of Wells Street, where it would eventually be widened into the Congress Expressway. This would require the demolition of the former Metropolitan Main Line, as well as the Garfield Line to the west. Service on these lines was slowly disrupted in stages as work progressed throughout the 50s. On April 4, 1954, trains from the Douglas Park branch were rerouted off of the former Metropolitan Main Line and onto the Paulina connector, using the Lake Street line to access the loop instead. This separated out the 2 former Metropolitan services and made them 2 completely isolated services, thus increasing the number of operating patterns for services around the loop. On October 11, 1955, the former Metropolitan Main Line, which connected to Tower 8, needed to be demolished as part of the expressway construction. The former Metropolitan Terminal at Wells Street, which was now out of use, was demolished, and the tracks which had connected to it were extended to connect to the loop just south of Quincy Station and north of the former Tower 8. A new temporary tower was installed at this location and given the name Tower 22, continuing the original numbering pattern from the early days of the loop. By June 22, 1958, construction of the new expressway was finally complete, and on that day, the CTA opened a new line in the median of the expressway. Today, it's the Forest Park branch of the Blue Line. The Douglas and Garfield line services were shifted over onto this new line, which connected to both of those respective branches, as well as the Milwaukee-Dearborn subway. This meant that all these trains would cease to use the loop, bringing the number of CTA trains that did use the loop down to an all-time low of only 3 during rush hour and only 2 during off-peak hours, the Lake Street line and the Ravenswood. Tower 22 and the Metropolitan Main Line were all demolished. On January 21, 1963, the North Shore line ceased operations due to declining profits. As a result, loop service as a whole was reduced to just these few CTA services. The 1960s saw an explosion in automobile usage, which would continue to eat away at the CTA's ridership base. But the CTA was determined to adapt with society and see if they could find new ways to provide service to the now car-dominated city. The Congress line, in the median of the Congress Expressway, was viewed as a massive success, and the CTA wanted to recapture the success with the additional expressways that would continue to open over the course of the next decade or two. In September of 1968, the Dan Ryan Expressway opened, and a new CTA line was built to run down the middle. This line would connect over the now disused south side elevated tracks to reach the loop. Instead of simply circling the loop and returning to its starting point as the other lines did, the new Dan Ryan line was through routed with the Lake Street line, forming what would become known as the west-south route. Loop operations were modified once again to accommodate this new service pattern. For the first time since 1913, trains returned to operating bidirectionally in the loop, although now, since it was standard system-wide, trains would run on the right-hand track, meaning that the directions of the two tracks were reversed from how they'd been in the early days. Trains entering from the Lake Street line at Tower 18 would run clockwise around only half of the inner loop, and serving the stations on Lake Street and Wabash Avenue, exiting again at Tower 12 to reach the Dan Ryan line. Northbound trains from the Dan Ryan would enter at Tower 12 and run counterclockwise on the outer loop track. These trains too would only serve the half of the loop along Wabash and Lake before exiting again, heading back to the terminal at Harlem. Ravenswood line trains would continue to make the full counterclockwise circle on the outer loop track. During rush hours, the Evanston Express would operate clockwise around the inner loop. All of this new operational pattern meant that there was no inner loop service during off-peak hours or on weekends along the Wells and Van Buren sides of the loop. So, just 2 days after the new routing took effect, the CTA began operating the Loop Shuttle train, which was a train that just operated continuously around the inner loop, providing additional flexibility for passengers. 5 years went by, and the CTA was beginning to feel the financial strain as the automobile firmly took hold as the dominant form of transportation. 1973 saw some of the most drastic service cuts in the agency's history. In September of that year, State and Van Buren Station closed due to low ridership and rising costs. Just weeks later, the Loop Shuttle train was discontinued. The CTA was struggling to keep up with the changing times. Throughout the mid to late 1900s, automobile usage soared, population became further spread into the suburbs, and transit usage declined badly. The old train lines were beginning to be viewed as outdated. The 1890s infrastructure was aging severely, and the CTA was quickly losing the money needed to maintain it. Besides, who wanted to maintain poorly used, antiquated infrastructure anyway? Subways and expressway transit lines seemed to be the way of the future. Ever since Chicago had started building subways in the 1930s, there had been talk of eventually building the subway network up to a point where the elevated loop could become obsolete, and eventually even be demolished. Two serious proposals were put forward for new subways with that specific goal in mind. One was in 1958 and the other in 1968. Ultimately, both of these proposals were abandoned because, again, the CTA had little money to spare. Tunneling is enormously expensive, especially in dense city centers. The second of these two proposals did gain serious traction, however. Much planning work for these subways was undertaken throughout the 1970s. Support for this plan was significantly bolstered in 1977 when one of the most tragic accidents in CTA history occurred in the loop. The accident was caused from two trains colliding, causing one train to derail, and half of this train actually fell off the elevated loop structure and into the street below. The accident was horrifying and tragic, resulting in the death of 11 passengers and the injury of nearly 200 other people. Ultimately, however, the leading cause of the accident was found to be negligence on the part of the train's operator, and not a fault with the elevated loop itself. Opposition to the loop's removal from preservationists, alongside of concerns over whether the subway project was really the best use of the funding, persisted, and in 1978, the loop was added to the National Register of Historic Places. By 1979, the plans for the new subways had officially been dropped, and the funds were dispersed elsewhere. Thus, the early 1980s found the CTA with a loop that was officially historic, and they were going to have to keep it around for the foreseeable future. The next several years saw some significant investment into the loop's old stations. Quincy Station was remodeled with the goal to have the aesthetics of the new station to match as closely as possible to the way it had appeared at its opening in the 1890s. The station was closed in November of 1985 to allow for reconstruction work, and reopened in February of 1988. The remainder of the loop was to be improved and modernized. Adams and Wabash Station received extensive renovations, resulting in a series of temporary and partial closures, beginning in 1987 and concluding in 1989. This modernization of the loop would continue into the 1990s, which was perhaps one of the most pivotal decades for the entire CTA network. Much like the rest of the system, the loop would see a number of major changes over the course of that decade. In March of 1992, Clark and Lake Station was reconfigured, with its entrance stairs from the street removed. A new entrance was provided to the inner loop platform directly from the second floor of the State of Illinois Center building, which is now the Thompson Center. Another entrance connected the outer loop platform directly to the second floor of the 203 North LaSalle building. Both of these buildings had been built in the mid-1980s, and the State of Illinois Center had been built to include an entrance directly from its basement connecting to the Lake Transfer subway station on the west-northwest route. The basement of 203 North LaSalle was redesigned to also include an entrance to the subway station in 1991. With the elevated platforms being connected to these same two buildings in 1992, the two stations were combined into one superstation, which took on the name Clark and Lake. The station features street-level entrances on both sides of Lake Street, with fare controls and access within the paid area, both up to the elevated platforms and down to the subway. The following year, in February of 1993, the CTA adopted color codes for all of its lines. For the lines in the loop, this meant that the Ravenswood line became the brown line, and the Evanston Express became the purple line express. The west-south route was not directly replaced with the color line. Instead, it was eliminated and replaced by the green line. The green line ran the same route as the west-south route along the Lake Street elevated and around the loop. South of the loop, however, this route would continue on the south side elevated instead of on the Dan Ryan. In October of 1993, the CTA opened the new Orange Line to Midway Airport. This line also entered the loop at Tower 12 and ran clockwise around the inner loop, once again providing services around the entirety of the inner loop at all times of day. Two changes came to the loop in January of 1994. On January 9th, the Lake Street and Southside branches closed for restoration. This resulted in the entire Green Line being suspended, leaving the loop only served by the brown and orange lines, supplemented by the purple line during rush hours. On January 30th, the CTA closed Madison and Wells Station. The station was demolished over the course of the next several years to make room for a new station at Washington Street. This station opened on July 17th of 1995, and it was named Washington and Wells. At the same time, the Randolph and Wells station was also closed and demolished, effectively combining the Randolph and Madison stations into the new one at Washington. This was part of the Loop Modernization Initiative began in the decade prior. In May of 1996, Green Line service was resumed on the Lake and Wabash sides of the loop. In 1997, the CTA rebuilt and reopened the station at State and Van Buren. Since the closure of the original station here, the Harold Washington Library had opened at this location, and it was anticipated that this would be a significant traffic source for the new station. As such, the new station was named Library, State and Van Buren. Also in 1997, the CTA debuted new destination signs on their trains. The older destination signs had typically shown either the route name or the two terminals the route served. When color codes were added to the lines in 1993, this simply meant coloring the destination signs the appropriate color for the route. However, since the old names were no longer used and the CTA had subsequently phased out their A-B skip-stop system, the new, redesigned destination signs showed only the destination towards which the train was currently headed. A unique setup had to be derived for trains that circled the loop. Trains heading into the loop would display a sign which simply read, "Loop," and upon entering, the train's operator would switch the sign to show the train's final destination. This helped for passengers outside of the loop to know if the train was headed into downtown or away from it. In 1998, the CTA was facing serious budget shortfalls. On April 27th of that year, major service cuts went into effect, which included the suspension of overnight service on the green and purple lines. The orange and brown lines had never had 24-hour service, which meant that the loop would be closed during overnight hours. After the eventful 1990s, the loop remained fairly unchanged into the 21st century. The first change came in 2006. On June 25th of that year, the CTA began experimenting with a new operating pattern. The Cermak branch of the Blue Line, formerly the Metropolitan Douglas branch, became its own line, the Pink Line. Trains from this line would continue to run over the Paulina connector to the Lake Street branch, and then run to the loop, in very much the same way that these trains had operated during the construction of the Congress Expressway. The Pink Line would join the Orange Line in operating clockwise around the inner loop during all daytime operating hours. This pattern would officially become permanent in 2007. The loop went another 9 years before seeing more major change. The only thing of note to happen during this time was on October 6, 2010, when Library, State and Van Buren Station was renamed to its current full name, Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren, making it the longest name of any station on the network, and also my favorite one to say.
Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren is next. Doors open on the right at Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren. Transfer to red and blue line trains at Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren. This is Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren. Transfer to red and blue line trains at Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren. This is a brown line train to Kimball. Doors closing.
In the mid-2010s, the CTA undertook the same station consolidation process on the Wabash side of the loop that they had done on the Wells side in the 90s. In 2015, Madison and Wabash Station was closed and demolished to make room for a new station constructed over the course of the next 2 years. On August 31st, 2017, the new Washington and Wabash Station opened. A few days later, on September 3rd, Randolph and Wabash Station closed as well, and this brought the number of stations on each side of the loop to a consistent 2 stations per side. By the mid-2020s, the loop was now 130 years old. While the railroad itself was still functioning well enough, some of the facilities were showing serious signs of age. The loop was home to the CTA's busiest stations, but also some of its most outdated. Now, out of the 8 loop stations, 6 had actually had recent work done to them. Clark and Lake had been rebuilt in the early 1990s, Washington and Wabash had been built in the 2010s, Adams and Wabash had just been renovated in the late 1980s, Harold Washington Library, State and Van Buren had been rebuilt in the late 1990s, Quincy, renovated in the mid to late 80s, and Washington and Wells had just been built in the mid 90s. This left State and Lake and LaSalle and Van Buren stations, neither of which had received any major work in their 100-plus year lifespans. The latter of these two saw significantly lower ridership than, indeed, most or all of the other loop stations, and also had passable station facilities. Quite inversely, State and Lake was one of the busiest stations on the network, serving as important interchange with the Red Line, as well as numerous bus routes on State Street. Its platforms were narrow, it had no mezzanine-level transfer bridge to connect the two platforms, and the amount of transfer traffic it saw made its lack of step-free access a worse challenge than normal. So, on January 5th, 2026, the CTA closed State and Lake Station to completely rebuild it. The project was scheduled to take 3 years, with the intention of the station's reopening in 2029. However, I'm writing the script in February of 2026, so it's impossible for me to say at this point whether or not that will happen on time. Maybe you're watching from the future, and you know. Either way, that brings us to the present day. Chicago's loop has truly seen a lot over the last 130 years that it has been around. Personally, I hope the loop will continue to serve Chicago for years to come. This video was a lot of fun to make. It was also one of the most labor-intensive projects I've undertaken so far in this channel. If you enjoyed it, consider sharing it with someone else who may also appreciate the history of this beloved Chicago landmark. Also, if you like learning the stories behind the L system that we have today, you can find a link in the description of this video to the full playlist of this series, The Oldest Rails. I already have videos discussing the red and yellow lines, and stay tuned for more videos on the other 5 lines of the CTA, as well as more content on all things transit and train related. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.